Chapter 14. The wind freshened throughout the night, gradually increasing until the frog was boiling happily along at a steady 4.5 knots. David sailed all night, held her off the wind, and let the sails fill and draw well. After sitting for days waiting for wind, after the frustration and boredom, it seemed that the frog had taken life, was flying across the sea, and he hated to stop even to go to the bathroom. Once he tied the rudder off with a piece of cord so he could go below and get a drink of water, but as soon as he drank, he returned to the cockpit. He kept sailing, holding her off the wind, gaining speed a little each hour, driving her, letting her ride the wind until he saw a silver of light ahead. The sun coming up in the east, and just as the sun broke out, the top curve of gold brilliance shafting across the water, he heard a sound, a high-pitched squealing sound, and the splashing of water, and a killer whale rose right next to him in the water. His heart almost stopped. The whale was enormous, rising so that its front half was totally clear of the water, towering over him, looking down on him, studying him. The black skin glistened with water, the white markings so defined they looked painted by an artist. High on the side of the whale's right eye stared at him, rotating, taking in everything in the cockpit. The eye looked intelligent, almost human. David couldn't cry out, couldn't think, couldn't do anything, and before he could breathe again, another whale rose, then another, and still another, until 4 of them surrounded the cockpit, moving with the boat in tandem, looking down on David sitting beneath them. They were beautiful and frightening, stunning, frightening at the same time. He felt lost, empty, gone. If they wanted, they could reach over and take him, just pluck him out of the boat any time. I could run below, he thought, let the tiller go and hide below, but they could simply run into the hull and batter a hole in it if they wanted him. He held course, wished for more wind, wished for speed, but knew that even on her best day with the best wind, he could not outrun them. Somewhere he'd heard that they could swim 20 to 30 knots an hour. They could circle him at the fastest speed he could hope to make, just loop around him with ease, play with him. They started making sounds, high-pitched squeaking sounds with clicks and odd intervals over the top of him, back and forth. One would make the sound, another would answer, then the third one picked it up, and finally the fourth, and it would start over. They're talking about me, he thought. No, they're talking me over, talking about what to do with me, like I was a toy or something to eat. Well, I'm not yet. I'm David Elspeth, he said aloud, directing his words to the whale nearest on the left. The eye glittered straight into him. I don't mean any harm. I only want to sail home. He felt silly speaking to them, but then thought they might silly speaking over him as well. There was no outward indication that his voice meant anything to them. The one nearest him on the left, he felt it must be the leader, but had no idea why, moved momentarily closer to him, leaned over him, but before David could react or jump into the cabin, the whale moved away again, made 3 more squeaks and a click, and lowered back into the water. The other whales did the same. Their huge dorsal fins flopped over to the side, curving up out of the water as they swam next to the frog, almost in formation with her. They would move away a bit, then swim in closer and closer until more than once they bumped the hull, not hard, but bumped it so the frog moved sideways a bit with every nudge. Then out, swim, and in close, out and in for miles. The whales stayed with him well into the morning, nearly to midday, but he did not feel them as a threat. It was more like the dolphins. David knew that sometimes dolphins would run ahead of a boat, stay just beneath the bow, and play with the boat as it sailed, and he felt the killer whales were playing with him now. They were not enemies. They could have taken him easily if they wanted to attack him. Lord, he thought, watching one swim closer and away, Lord, it is longer than the boat, bigger than the boat, my home. all that I am, and it is bigger. A living animal bigger than all that I am, Lord. And he suddenly remembered a prayer he had seen on a plaque for sale in a store at the marina. Lord, he said the prayer aloud, your sea is so large and my boat is so small. Have mercy. Even your whales, he thought, even your whales are bigger than my boat. Have mercy. In the end, he decided they were friends, coursing next to him with a great beauty for hours, holding their speed down to stay with him as he worked at sailing the Frog east, always east, running across the steady wind. And finally, when they turned and headed north, dead into the wind where he could not follow, he felt a sadness at their going, their leaving him. He waved, watching the whales he had to think to remember they were called a pod, watching them turn as if on command and cut north, picking up speed and slipping through the short waves the wind was now causing. He waved at them and wished they were not going, wished they were staying with him to run across this wonderful wind. Everything was different now. There was good wind, fresh enough so he could point the Frog up a bit and run slightly north of east and still hold good speed. He wasn't sure where he was, had actually no idea where he could possibly be with any exactness, but he figured California had to be almost straight east, and that he would have to hit somewhere along the coast if he kept going. He thought maybe down the coast a bit, maybe straight out from Los Angeles, because the storm had blown him south a bit as well as out to sea. But it didn't matter now. He marveled at how his situation could change so much just because there was wind. Such a little thing, and it changed his whole life. 1 minute everything was awful and looked terrible, and then the little wind would come and flop everything over. It was as if suddenly he owned the world, and he and the Frog owned the ocean, owned all of the ocean, and the world was mostly ocean. He could go anywhere. With wind, he could go anywhere, see anything, be anything. With wind, he could move with the whales. With wind, everything was possible. He thought he should feel sleepy after sailing all night, but daylight seemed to drive away sleep, and his body hummed with the boat and wind and sea. He tied the helm off again, more loosely this time, so he could come up into the wind, but it would take a long time, and that gave him a few moments to step below and drink 4 cups of water. Then he stretched and touched his toes to take away the night stiffness and went to the bathroom. When he climbed again out of the cabin top, he saw that she was starting to swing up a bit more. He took his t-shirt off and stood to the helm, not sitting but standing with the tiller handle against his leg. The boat heeled over at a mild angle. He tuned the sails to tighten the curve, stood again with his hip cocked, feeling the boat vibrate through the wood of the tiller into his hand and against the hip bone, and sailed. It was a joy. The sun was already hot and the wind solid and growing a bit each hour, and he got the Frog up to 5 knots and held it until the sun was straight ahead. In the heat of being becalmed, he had burned and begun to tan, and now with the wind and the spray of the night and a half a day, his body had become weathered and brown gold. His hair was already bleached out to the lighter blonde that he would become white, and his eyes were lined at the corners from squinting. In the afternoon, he saw clouds coming from his back, from the northwest, low clouds moving fast, and the wind stiffened again, pushing the Frog over to a more severe healing anger, though she still sailed well. And for the first time, he thought of himself as the Frog, as we. Well, he said aloud to her, not to himself, but to the boat, I guess we should reef sail if the wind is going to get stronger. And he meant we. He could no longer draw a line where he ended and the Frog began. He looked down at his bare feet, planted firmly on the floor of the cockpit, the vibration, the hum, the life of the Frog coming up through them into his legs, and he knew it would be we from now on. They were together, a thing of the sea, and the wind and the man all joined to sing in a single dance, to sail. To turn the force of the wind and the sea, the force of the earth and a person into a dance across the water. He wished he could sing and actually tried a verse, but his voice was so bad it didn't feel right. If I were a dolphin, he thought suddenly, if I were a dolphin, I would be the kind that swims just in front of the boat and leaps out of the water and spirals. I would be a dolphin that dances. He let the helm go, and the frog nosed up into the wind and lost her heel instantly. The sails started luffing, lapping in a breeze that wasn't as strong as he'd thought while he was sailing, but he decided to reef anyway. The process wasn't too complicated. He'd seen Owen do it twice, maybe 3 times. The idea was to reduce the area of the mainsail so it wouldn't catch so much wind. It was done by rotating the boom and wrapping the sail around it like a rolled up window shade until it was reduced enough so the wind couldn't blow the boat over. The boom was mounted to the mast on a gear, knuckle with a worm gear, and all that were required was to loosen the main halyard and use a crank handle for the winch to roll the boom. It took him a moment to find the crank and the drawer beneath the sink, and only a few minutes to roll the boom and bring the mainsail to about 3/4 of its size. In that time, the wind picked up. Suddenly, clouds covered the horizon, and some small ones gathered directly overhead. He put the crank away, held the helm over to back her around a bit, until the sails filled and she was moving once more. The sails didn't pull as well, but the boat still made 4 knots, and he had more control. She didn't heel as much when the wind gusted, which she did now with some frequency, and he sailed until close to dark, slamming now through the waves. Spray hitting him with the bow, plowed into a large one, sailed until he couldn't take it any more. He'd been up for he guessed 19 or 20 hours without rest or food, and the tiredness soaked into him. He let her come into the wind, went below, and slipped his t-shirt and windbreaker on. There was a coolness in the evening air that made him shiver. The rest of the chili was still in the ice chest, and he ate it cold. It didn't smell bad, or any worse than the chili always smelled. Worked around the yellow hunk of fat. Hungry as he was, he couldn't bring himself to eat them. He pitched them over the side.